That letter wasn't supposed to be there. It should have stayed buried under years of silence. But on a quiet Saturday morning in a small Manhattan park, a little black girl named Aaliyah Johnson saw it sticking halfway out from beneath an old wooden bench, as if the wind itself had pushed it toward her. The air was crisp, around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant city traffic, and Aaliyah paused mid-step, her small sneakers pressing into the gravel path as something about the envelope pulled her closer than curiosity alone. It was aged, slightly yellowed at the edges, as if it had been waiting far too long to be found, and in careful handwriting across the front was a name she didn't recognize, yet somehow felt heavy in her hands. William Harrington. She tilted her head, whispering softly to herself, "Why would someone hide a letter under a bench?" Her fingers hesitated before she reached down and pulled it free, dust scattering into the air like forgotten time, and for a moment everything around her seemed quieter, as if the park itself was holding its breath. She glanced around, half expecting someone to appear and claim it, but the benches remained empty except for a few early morning joggers in the distance and an elderly couple feeding pigeons near the fountain. Aaliyah carefully sat down, placing the letter on her lap, her small hands tracing the edges of the envelope as if it might explain itself, and that was when she noticed something else. The seal had been broken once before, then carefully resealed, as though someone had opened it, regretted it, and hidden it away again. She swallowed, her curiosity now mixed with a strange sense of responsibility, and slowly she opened it. Inside was a single folded page, delicate and trembling with age, and as her eyes scanned the first line, she froze. The name William Harrington appeared again, but this time it was written not as a signature, but as part of a message that felt deeply personal, like something never meant for anyone else to read. Before she could continue, footsteps echoed faintly across the gravel behind her, steady and deliberate, the kind of footsteps that did not belong to someone rushing, but to someone who expected the world to move around them. Aaliyah looked up, instinctively tucking the letter closer to her chest, and there he was. William Harrington. In person, he was a tall man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat that contrasted with the soft morning light, his expression calm but distant in the way of someone used to being unapproachable. He stopped a few feet away, speaking into a phone call that ended the moment his eyes landed on her. Silence stretched between them, thick and immediate, as though the park had narrowed into just that single moment. Aaliyah stood slowly, holding the letter with both hands now, and before she fully understood why, she stepped forward. "Do you know this name?" she asked, her voice small but steady, lifting the letter slightly so he could see it. William's gaze dropped to the paper, and for the first time something in his face shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a locked door inside him had been touched by the wrong key. He reached out, then stopped himself, his hand hovering in the air for a fraction of a second before falling back to his side. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly, his voice lower than before, controlled but no longer distant. Aaliyah glanced back at the bench. "It was under there," she said simply, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. William looked at the letter again, and this time the calmness in his expression fractured just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition buried under years of silence. The kind of recognition that does not belong to strangers. The kind that belongs to unfinished stories. And in that moment, neither of them knew it yet, but the name written on that paper was about to change everything they thought they understood about who they were and what had been lost. Neither of them moved for a long moment, as the sound of distant traffic faded into the background, and even the morning breeze seemed to hesitate around them. William finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, but his eyes never left the letter in Aaliyah's hands. Aaliyah tightened her grip, slightly, sensing without understanding that this was not just paper anymore, but something far heavier. The man in front of her, powerful beyond anything she had ever known, looked suddenly like someone standing at the edge of a memory he had spent years trying to forget. Somewhere in that silence, the past began to breathe again, and neither the girl nor the billionaire yet understood that this moment under the pale morning light was only the beginning of a truth neither of them could turn away from. William Harrington did not move for several seconds, his eyes locked on the fragile paper in the little girl's hands, as if it had suddenly become heavier than anything he had ever carried in his entire life. The morning breeze brushed past them, but it no longer felt light, only sharp and distant, as though the world had quietly stepped back to give them space. Aaliyah Johnson shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure why the man in front of her looked like someone who had just seen a ghost without the world around him changing at all. William finally spoke again, his voice controlled but lower than before, careful in the way people speak when they are trying not to break something inside themselves. "I asked you where you found that," he repeated, his eyes flicking from the letter to the bench and back again, as if searching for an explanation that would make the moment less real. Aaliyah held the letter tighter against her chest now, her small fingers pressing into the paper edges. "Under the bench," she said again, more quietly this time, sensing that her answer mattered more than she understood. William exhaled slowly, looking away for the first time, his gaze drifting across the park like he needed distance to think. A jogger passed behind him, the sound of footsteps fading quickly, and yet neither of them reacted, as if time itself had slowed just for this conversation. "That is not possible," William said at last, though the words sounded less like certainty and more like something he was telling himself. He reached up and rubbed the side of his temple, a subtle gesture that revealed more tension than his composed expression allowed. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "It was just there," she said, her voice still gentle, not accusing, only honest. William looked back at her, and for the first time his gaze softened just enough to reveal something beneath the surface, not warmth, but recognition fighting against resistance. He extended his hand slowly, not taking the letter yet, only hovering near it again as though afraid of what touching it might confirm. "May I see it?" he asked, each word measured carefully. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, then nodded and handed it forward. The moment William took the envelope, something subtle changed in his posture, a shift so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching closely. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper, and his eyes lowered to the handwriting once more. The name William Harrington stared back at him, not as an introduction, but as a reminder. For a brief moment, his breathing became uneven, almost unnoticeable, before he steadied himself again. "Where did you really find this?" he asked again. But this time there was something different in his tone, not disbelief anymore, but caution, as if the answer could open a door he had kept locked for a very long time. Aaliyah pointed behind her toward the bench. "Right there," she said simply. William followed her gesture, staring at the wooden slats, as if expecting them to explain themselves. The park around them continued as normal, leaves shifting, distant city noise flowing, people moving without awareness of the quiet tension forming in the center of it all. But for William, none of it felt normal anymore. His grip on the letter tightened just slightly before loosening again, a controlled restraint that hinted at something deeper beneath his calm exterior. A memory flickered at the edge of his thoughts, not fully formed, just fragments he refused to fully acknowledge. A different time, a different place, a promise made and never resolved. He blinked once, slowly, as if trying to push it back down where it belonged. Aaliyah watched him carefully now, sensing the change in him even if she did not understand it. "Do you know what it says?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Without intending to, William looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time beyond the letter itself. His expression softened again, but only slightly, like a crack in a wall that had held for years. "No," he answered too quickly, then paused, correcting himself in a quieter voice. "Not yet." The word lingered between them, incomplete and heavy. Aaliyah glanced down at the envelope, then back at him. "It has your name on it," she said, as if stating a simple fact that should have an equally simple explanation. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he folded the letter carefully, almost instinctively, as though handling it the wrong way might cause something irreversible. When he finally spoke, his voice had regained some control, but not all of it. "Sometimes names are written where they do not belong," he said, though even he did not seem convinced by his own words. The wind shifted again, brushing between them, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Aaliyah stood still, waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. William looked down at the folded letter in his hand, then back toward the bench, and then finally at her again. Something unresolved lingered in his expression, a tension between denial and recognition that had not yet settled into certainty. And in that fragile silence, it became clear that whatever this letter was, it had not only been found by chance, but had also found its way back to him for a reason he was not ready to face. William Harrington stood still with the folded letter now resting in his hand, but his attention was no longer on the physical object alone. It was as if the paper had become a trigger for something buried far beneath years of carefully controlled silence. Aaliyah Johnson remained in front of him, her small frame steady but uncertain, watching his expression shift in ways she did not yet understand. Around them, the park continued to move in soft motion, a cyclist passing in the distance, the faint sound of water from a nearby fountain. Yet inside this small circle of space, everything felt paused, suspended between what was known and what was about to be revealed. William finally looked up again, and when he did, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier edge. "You said it was under the bench," he repeated, not as a question now, but as if confirming something only he could fully measure. Aaliyah nodded once, then added softly, "I saw it sticking out a little, like someone forgot it." Those words landed differently for him. Forgotten. The word lingered longer than expected. William lowered his gaze again, unfolding the letter with careful precision, as though any sudden movement might disturb the fragile balance of the moment. The paper crackled softly in the morning air, and his eyes scanned the first lines again, this time slower, as if reading them could either confirm or deny the thoughts forming behind his expression. Aaliyah stepped slightly closer without realizing it, curiosity pulling her forward more than fear pulling her back. William noticed her presence, but did not step away. Instead, he spoke in a tone that felt less like instruction and more like reluctant honesty. "This was written a long time ago," he said, though he did not specify how long. His eyes narrowed slightly as he reached the middle of the page, and for a fraction of a second, something in his composure faltered again. Not dramatically, not visibly to the world, but enough for someone standing only a few feet away to sense. Aaliyah tilted her head. "Is it important?" she asked. William hesitated before answering, and that hesitation carried more weight than any direct statement could. "It used to be," he said finally. The wind shifted again, brushing against the trees above them, causing a soft rustle that filled the silence between their words. William folded the letter halfway, then paused, as if reconsidering whether it should be closed at all. His thumb traced the edge of the paper slowly, and his gaze drifted back toward the bench, now just an ordinary structure in an ordinary park, yet carrying the weight of something far from ordinary. Aaliyah followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "Did someone lose it?" she asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at her again, studying her face as if searching for something beyond the present moment. There was no recognition in her eyes of the story he was carrying, only innocence and patience. That contrast seemed to affect him more than he expected. "People do not always lose things by accident," he said quietly. The statement hung there without explanation. Aaliyah frowned slightly, trying to understand, but did not press further. William finally closed the letter completely, holding it now with both hands. His posture straightened, returning to the controlled composure of someone used to managing rooms, conversations, and outcomes. But something had shifted beneath that structure. A crack had formed, even if only barely visible. A passing couple walked behind them, their conversation fading as they moved out of range, unaware of the quiet intensity unfolding only a few steps away. William took a slow breath, then spoke again, this time more directly. "I need to take this with me," he said. Aaliyah looked at the letter, then back at him. There was no resistance in her expression, only a small hesitation, as if she sensed that whatever this was, it mattered in a way beyond her understanding. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said simply. William hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing the letter carefully inside his coat pocket, as though securing something fragile and irreplaceable. Once it was out of sight, the air between them changed slightly, not lighter, but more uncertain. He looked down at her again, and for the first time his voice softened in a way that felt almost unintended. "Thank you," he said, though it was not clear whether he was thanking her for finding it or for something far less visible. Aaliyah shifted her weight and glanced back at the bench once more. "Will you read it?" she asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, He looked toward the skyline beyond the trees, where the morning light was beginning to grow stronger, casting longer reflections across the park. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a restrained weight, as if every word had to pass through something internal before reaching the air. "I do not know yet," he said. And in that uncertainty, something unspoken settled between them, a beginning that neither of them had chosen, but both had now become part of. The park continued around them, unchanged, but for William Harrington, nothing about the morning felt ordinary anymore. William Harrington had barely walked half a block away from the bench when he realized he was still holding his coat pocket tighter than usual, as if the folded letter inside had weight far beyond paper. Aaliyah Johnson remained behind for a moment, watching him from a distance, her small silhouette framed against the soft morning light, before she slowly turned back toward the playground path. William continued walking, but his steps were no longer as steady as before. Each stride felt slightly misaligned with his usual rhythm, as though something unseen had disrupted the structure of his thoughts. The city around him remained active, taxis moving through the nearby street, distant horns echoing between buildings, yet he felt strangely separated from all of it. He reached the edge of the park where his black vehicle was waiting, the driver already stepping out to open the door. "Good morning, sir," the driver said professionally. William gave a brief nod, but did not immediately enter. Instead, he paused beside the door, his hand resting on the frame, his gaze momentarily distant. The driver noticed the hesitation, but said nothing, only waiting. William finally got into the vehicle, closing the door behind him with a controlled motion that contrasted with the tension he carried inside. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city began to blur past the tinted windows, but William's attention remained fixed inward. The folded letter was still in his pocket, and he could feel its presence like a constant reminder of something unresolved. Across town, Aaliyah walked slowly along the park path, her small hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. She kept glancing back once or twice, though William was no longer visible. Something about the encounter had left her with more questions than answers, though she could not fully articulate why. The park now felt different, as if the ordinary morning had been quietly interrupted by something she could not yet name. She eventually reached a small bench near the fountain and sat down for a moment, watching the water ripple under the morning light. Meanwhile, inside the moving vehicle, William finally reached into his coat pocket and removed the letter again. The driver noticed the movement through the rearview mirror, but quickly returned his eyes to the road. William unfolded the paper once more, this time with less hesitation. The handwriting seemed unchanged, yet it felt different to him now, as though each word carried a weight that had been dormant for years. His eyes moved across the page slowly, stopping at certain lines longer than others. The more he read, the more his expression tightened in subtle layers, not shock, but recognition mixed with something far more complex. He leaned back slightly in his seat, exhaling through his nose as if trying to steady himself. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, and in that silence, fragments of memory began to surface. Not clear images, but impressions. A voice he had not heard in a long time. A place that no longer existed in the same way. A promise made in a moment that now felt far removed from the life he had built. He opened his eyes again, looking down at the letter as if expecting it to change under scrutiny, but it remained the same. The driver spoke cautiously without turning fully around. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked. William hesitated before responding, folding the letter halfway again. "Continue to the office," he said, his tone controlled but distant. Yet even as he gave the instruction, his attention was not on the destination ahead. It was still anchored to the words in his hand and the invisible thread they had begun to pull from deep within his past. The vehicle merged into traffic, joining the flow of morning commuters, but William felt increasingly disconnected from the purpose of the journey. He looked out the window at passing buildings, each one reflecting a life moving forward, while his own attention remained fixed on something that had not moved in years. The letter rested against his palm now, no longer just an object, but a signal that something unfinished had returned. He folded it carefully again and placed it back into his pocket, but even after it was hidden, its presence remained unchanged. The car continued forward through the city streets, but inside, William Harrington was no longer entirely focused on where he was going. because part of him had already returned to somewhere he thought he had left behind. The black car carrying William Harrington moved steadily through the mid-morning traffic of Manhattan, merging between taxis, delivery vans, and pedestrians crossing at regulated intervals. Yet inside the vehicle, the atmosphere felt detached from the city's natural rhythm. William sat in the back seat, posture upright but not relaxed, his attention divided between the passing streets and the folded letter resting once again inside his coat pocket. He had instructed the driver to head toward the office, but the words felt automatic, as if spoken by habit rather than intention. The driver maintained a professional silence, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror, sensing that something about his employer's demeanor was different from usual, though nothing had been explicitly said. William looked out at a large intersection where people waited for the pedestrian signal, and for a brief moment his focus drifted, not on the crowd itself, but on the idea of how many lives continued forward without interruption while his own had suddenly been pulled backward. He exhaled slowly and shifted slightly in his seat, his hand unconsciously pressing against the pocket where the letter was kept, as if confirming it was still there. At that exact moment, across the city in the park, Aaliyah Johnson stood up from the bench near the fountain and began walking again, her small steps unhurried but thoughtful. She had not fully processed what had happened earlier, but she carried the memory of William Harrington's expression with her, the way his calm exterior had shifted when he saw the name on the paper. It was not something she understood, but it was something she could feel had meaning beyond her reach. She looked back once more at the wooden bench where she had found the letter, now just an ordinary object in an ordinary space, yet no longer feeling ordinary at all. Meanwhile, inside the vehicle, William's thoughts continued to circle back to the letter. He reached into his pocket again and removed it, unfolding it with slower movement this time, not out of hesitation but out of a growing inability to ignore it. The driver noticed the movement but said nothing, maintaining focus on the road as the car passed through another intersection. William's eyes scanned the page once more, but instead of reading it line by line, he seemed to be searching for something between the lines, something not immediately visible. The city outside continued its steady motion, but inside the vehicle the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter, heavier, and more inward. William's expression tightened slightly as he reached a particular section of the letter, his jaw setting briefly before relaxing again. It was subtle, but it reflected a struggle that remained entirely internal. He folded the letter halfway, then stopped, leaving it partially open in his hand, as if unable to fully commit to putting it away again. The driver finally spoke after a long stretch of silence, his tone careful and respectful. "Sir, we are approaching the financial district. Should I proceed to the main entrance?" he asked. William did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the paper for a few seconds longer before he slowly looked up toward the window. The skyline of office buildings rose ahead, glass reflecting the morning light, structured and predictable, a world that typically matched his sense of order. Yet today, that structure felt slightly misaligned with his internal state. He closed the letter slowly, this time with deliberate control, and placed it back inside his pocket. "Yes," he finally said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. The car continued forward, approaching the familiar entrance of the building where William Harrington was expected to resume the demands of his day. But as the vehicle slowed near the curb and the driver prepared to stop, William remained seated for a brief moment longer, looking straight ahead without moving. The world outside expected him to step back into routine, into meetings and decisions and schedules that defined his life. Yet something unseen had already shifted within him. The letter remained hidden in his pocket, but its presence was no longer just physical. It had become a quiet interruption that followed him even as the door was opened and the city continued moving around him. William Harrington remained seated inside the black vehicle even after it had fully stopped at the curb in front of the glass tower in the financial district. The morning light reflected off the building's surface in sharp geometric patterns, but none of it registered in the way it normally would for him. His hand rested inside his coat pocket, lightly pressing against the folded letter as if confirming its continued existence was necessary before stepping back into a world that expected certainty and control. The driver had already opened the door and was waiting respectfully, but William did not move immediately. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed forward, distant and unfocused, as though the act of exiting the car required more than physical motion. Finally, he exhaled once, slow and controlled, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city noise returned instantly, the familiar rhythm of footsteps, conversations, and traffic surrounding him. But internally, he felt slightly misaligned, as if part of him was still sitting inside the car with the letter. He adjusted his coat and began walking toward the building entrance, where a security staff member greeted him with professional recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," the guard said. William gave a brief nod but did not respond verbally, continuing inside without slowing his pace. The lobby was polished and symmetrical, filled with the usual morning activity of employees moving toward elevators and meetings, yet William's attention remained subtly divided. He moved through the space with practiced efficiency, but something beneath that routine had shifted. As he entered the private elevator reserved for executive access, the doors closed softly behind him, sealing him into a quieter space. The elevator began its ascent, and for the first time that morning, there was no external noise competing for his attention. He reached into his pocket again and removed the letter, unfolding it fully in the enclosed silence. The paper looked unchanged, but the context around it had altered everything about how he perceived it. He read again, more slowly now, not searching for new information, but trying to understand what it was already forcing him to remember. The elevator numbers changed steadily above the door, but he was no longer tracking them. Instead, his focus drifted inward once more, and this time the memory that surfaced felt less fragmented. It was a place, not just an image. A conversation, not just a phrase. A moment in time where choices had been made that were never revisited. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, still holding the letter. When the elevator arrived at the top floor, the doors opened with a soft chime, and his assistant was already waiting with a tablet in hand. "Good morning, sir. Your first meeting is scheduled in 10 minutes, she said, walking alongside him as he stepped into the hallway. William folded the letter carefully, this time with slower precision, and placed it back into his pocket without responding immediately. The assistant noticed his silence, but did not press further, continuing to walk beside him while reviewing the schedule. As they approached the conference room, voices could be heard from inside, discussions already underway, the usual structure of his professional life continuing without interruption. Yet William paused just before entering. The assistant stopped as well, sensing the shift in his pace. "Is everything all right?" she asked cautiously. William did not answer at first. His hand remained near his pocket, and for a brief moment, the confidence that defined him in every professional setting seemed slightly distant. Then he straightened his posture, reasserting control over his expression. "Proceed as planned," he said finally, and stepped into the room. The conversation inside briefly paused as he entered, everyone acknowledging his arrival. Chairs adjusted, documents were straightened, and attention shifted toward him as expected. William took his seat at the head of the table, placing his phone down and opening a folder in front of him. Everything appeared normal again from the outside, structured and precise. But beneath that surface something remained unresolved. The letter was still with him, hidden but not forgotten. And as the meeting began and voices filled the room with financial updates and projections, William Harrington listened while carrying a thought that no one else in the room could see, a quiet interruption that had begun in a park and had not yet ended. Inside the conference room on the top floor of Harrington Global, the atmosphere was structured and precise, filled with the soft sound of pages turning, pens tapping lightly against polished wood, and the low hum of controlled professional discussion. Large glass panels stretched from floor to ceiling, showing a panoramic view of Manhattan under a pale morning sky. William Harrington sat at the head of the long table, posture composed, expression neutral, as executives on both sides reviewed quarterly reports and market projections. On the surface, everything reflected order and authority, the environment he had built his entire career around. Yet beneath that surface, William was only partially present. The folded letter remained inside his inner coat pocket, and even though it was physically hidden, its presence felt increasingly difficult to ignore. As one of the senior analysts spoke about investment diversification across emerging markets, William's gaze briefly drifted toward the glass wall, where reflections of the city overlapped with the room. For a moment, The sound of voices around him faded into background noise, replaced by an internal silence that felt heavier than any presentation. He blinked once, then refocused, returning his attention to the discussion, but something in his concentration had shifted. Across the city, Aaliyah Johnson sat on a different bench near a quieter section of the park, drawing small shapes in the gravel with a stick she had found on the ground. She was not thinking about business meetings or financial districts, but the image of William Harrington still lingered in her mind. There had been something about the way he looked at the letter, not just as paper, but as something alive with meaning. She did not yet understand why it mattered, only that it did. Back in the conference room, William raised his hand slightly, signaling for a pause in the presentation. The room quieted immediately, attention shifting toward him as the speaker stopped mid-sentence. William leaned slightly forward, placing both hands on the table, his expression controlled but more distant than usual. "Continue without me for a moment," he said calmly. The executives exchanged brief glances, but no one questioned him. It was not unusual for him to step out of meetings, but there was something in his tone that made the request feel slightly different. He stood, adjusting his jacket, and walked toward the glass door at the far end of the room. Once outside, in the private hallway, the ambient noise of the meeting faded completely. William paused, placing a hand against the wall for a brief moment, as if grounding himself. Then he reached into his pocket again and retrieved the letter. This time, he did not unfold it immediately. Instead, he simply held it, staring at it as if waiting for it to explain itself without words. The hallway was quiet, lit by soft recessed lighting that created long shadows along the polished floor. He slowly unfolded the letter once more, and this time his eyes did not move quickly across the page. They lingered on specific lines longer than before, as though each sentence carried a weight that extended beyond its written meaning. His jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed, but his grip on the paper remained steady. As he reached the final portion of the letter, something subtle changed in his expression. Not shock, not confusion, but a quiet recognition that seemed to settle deeper than either of those reactions. He lowered the letter slightly, exhaling through his nose, then looked down the empty hallway, as if expecting someone to appear and interrupt what he was beginning to understand. But there was no one. Only silence, distance, and the faint echo of a meeting still continuing behind closed doors. William folded the letter again, slower this time, and instead of placing it back immediately into his pocket, he held it for a few seconds longer. In that brief pause, it was clear that whatever structure he had maintained throughout his life was no longer entirely intact in the way it had been before the morning began. The letter was no longer just something found under a bench. It had become something far more difficult to leave behind. He finally placed it back into his pocket and straightened his posture, preparing to return to the meeting room. But his expression carried a subtle shift that no presentation or financial report could fully contain. And as he walked back through the glass doors, the world of numbers and decisions waited for him, unaware that something from his past had already begun to quietly rewrite the way he would move through it. William Harrington returned to the conference room with a controlled expression, the kind of composure that had been refined over years of board meetings, negotiations, and financial decisions that shaped entire markets. The glass doors closed softly behind him, and the room immediately resumed its structured rhythm as if nothing had changed during his brief absence. The analyst continued speaking, projecting charts onto the screen showing quarterly growth projections, but William's attention was no longer fully anchored to the data in front of him. He sat down again at the head of the table, placing his hands together, listening with the appearance of focus, while internally something continued to echo from the folded letter now resting in his inner pocket. Across the table, his chief financial officer glanced at him briefly, noticing a subtle difference in his stillness, but said nothing. The presentation moved forward, discussing expansion strategies in international markets. Yet William's mind drifted intermittently, slipping between the present conversation and fragments of the letter he had read only moments earlier. Outside the building, the city remained in motion under a soft midday light. Taxis moving through intersections, pedestrians crossing in steady flows, life continuing in predictable patterns that contrasted sharply with the internal disruption William was experiencing. In the park, Aaliyah Johnson was now sitting on a different bench, her small legs swinging slightly above the ground as she watched leaves fall slowly from nearby trees. She had not told anyone about the man she met, nor did she fully understand why she felt the encounter mattered so much. It was not fear or excitement, but a quiet sense that something important had passed through her morning and left an imprint she could not ignore. Back inside the building, William finally spoke during the meeting, his voice calm, but slightly delayed, as if measured more carefully than usual. He asked a question about the financial risk assessment being presented, and the room responded immediately, shifting attention to address him. For a brief moment, the structure of the meeting resumed its normal balance. But even as answers were given and slides changed, William's focus remained divided. When the meeting concluded nearly 40 minutes later, executives began gathering their documents and standing, chairs sliding softly against the floor. William remained seated for a few seconds longer than everyone else, hands resting on the table, gaze fixed forward without engaging in conversation. His assistant approached quietly, holding a tablet with his next schedule. "You have a strategy review session in 20 minutes, she said. William nodded once, then stood. As the room emptied, he walked toward the glass corridor outside, the folded letter still secured inside his pocket. The hallway outside the conference room was quieter, the polished floor reflecting overhead lights in long, clean lines. William stopped near the window overlooking the city, looking down at the streets far below where people appeared as small moving figures. For a moment, he did not think about numbers, investments, or timelines. Instead, his attention returned to the letter, not as an object, but as a presence that had begun to follow him through every space he entered. He slowly reached into his pocket and touched it without removing it, as if confirming once again that it was still there. His reflection in the glass showed a composed exterior, but behind it something less stable had begun to form, subtle, but persistent. A decision point that had not yet revealed itself fully. He looked at the city for a few more seconds, then turned away from the window and began walking again, returning to the structured demands of his day, while carrying something within him that no schedule could fully contain. William Harrington stood in the corridor outside the strategy review room with the city skyline stretched beyond the glass. Yet his attention was no longer on the view or the schedule waiting for him inside the building. The folded letter remained in his inner pocket, but now it felt less like an object he was carrying and more like something quietly guiding the direction of his thoughts. The rhythm of his day, once defined by structure and precision, now felt interrupted by something he could not fully categorize. He checked his watch, a habit formed from years of disciplined timing. But for the first time that morning, the numbers did not give him clarity. Instead, they felt disconnected from what he was experiencing internally. A soft notification sounded from his assistant's tablet, reminding him of another scheduled meeting, but William raised his hand slightly, signaling for a delay. She hesitated but nodded, stepping back without question. He turned toward the window again, looking down at the city streets far below, where life continued in steady motion, unaware of the quiet shift occurring in the life of one of its most powerful figures. Across the city, in the same park where the morning had begun, Aaliyah Johnson was now sitting alone on a different bench near the edge of a shaded walkway. The light had shifted slightly, growing warmer, and people moved past her in casual afternoon patterns, but she remained still, tracing small lines in the gravel with the tip of her finger. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the man she had met earlier, not because she understood him, but because she did not. There had been something about his reaction to the letter that felt too heavy for a simple coincidence. And even though she did not have the language to define it, she could feel that something important had been set in motion. Back inside the financial district tower, William finally made a decision that did not align with any item on his schedule. He turned away from the window and walked past his assistant without speaking, moving toward the private elevator again. She called his name softly, asking if he needed anything, but he did not respond immediately. Instead, he paused at the elevator entrance, pressing the button and waiting as the doors opened. When they did, he stepped inside alone. As the elevator descended, the silence around him deepened, allowing his thoughts to surface more clearly. He reached into his pocket and removed the letter once more, unfolding it carefully in the confined space. This time, he did not read it quickly or partially. He read every line with full attention, allowing the words to settle without interruption. The content was no longer just information. It was becoming a structure of meaning that he could no longer ignore. His expression remained controlled, but there was a visible stillness in his posture that suggested internal conflict had reached a point of clarity rather than confusion. The elevator doors opened at the lobby, and William stepped out into the public flow of the building once again. Employees moved around him, conversations continued, and phones rang in the background. But he moved through it differently now, less as someone returning to routine and more as someone moving with a purpose that had not been present earlier in the day. He exited the building and stepped onto the sidewalk, the afternoon air cooler than expected. He stopped briefly at the curb, looking in both directions, not for transportation, but as if deciding direction itself. Then, without calling for his driver or assistant, he began walking. The city around him continued its steady rhythm, but his movement was no longer aligned with his schedule. He walked several blocks without stopping, passing storefronts, intersections, and clusters of people who paid him no attention. Eventually, his steps slowed as he approached the familiar park from earlier in the day. The benches, trees, and fountain were the same, but the atmosphere felt different in the afternoon light. He scanned the area once, then again, until he spotted her. Aaliyah was still there, now standing near the fountain, watching the water as it moved in soft patterns under the light breeze. William approached slowly, stopping a few feet away before she noticed him. When she turned and saw him, her expression shifted slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, holding the weight of the decision that had brought him back. The letter remained in his pocket, but its influence no longer felt confined to paper. It had expanded into something that now included both of them in ways neither fully understood. After a long pause, William finally spoke, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I need to ask you something," he said, and in that moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it had at any point since they first met.